Let me introduce you to our first keynote speaker this morning. And this is Christine Kim. And she got up very early this morning to drive up here from our nation's capital. She's a policy analyst focusing on welfare, family, and marriage at the Heritage Foundation. Her research includes analyzing socio-demographic trends and empirical studies on the intact families and religion's involvements, contributions to individual well-being and the common good. She's also written on the 1996 Welfare Reform Act and the effectiveness of abstinence education. She's currently pursuing a doctoral degree in political science, Georgetown University. She holds a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown from 2005 with a concentration in education, social, and family policy. She graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa with a bachelor's degree in history from Yale University in 2001. Would you please join me in welcoming Christine?
Well, thank you for getting up so early this morning to come to this conference and this presentation. I will have a slideshow presentation with lots of slides, which you have in front of you. So if you can't, see it, it will be larger, but you'll have the handout out as well. So I'd just like to get started this morning and talk about restoring the foundation, why marriage and the intact family matter. Do I need to? Okay, great. Oh, there you go. The culture of poverty makes a comeback. Headlines in a recent New York Times article that points to a resurgent interest in cultural explanation of poverty among younger academics. For more than 40 years, the article explains, social scientists investigating the causes of poverty have tended to treat cultural explanations like Lord Voldemort of the Harry Potter series, that which must not be named. The reticence, it goes on to say, was a legacy of the ugly battles that erupted after the late New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then an assistant labor secretary in the Johnson administration, introduced the idea of a culture of poverty to the public in a startling 1965 report. Princeton sociologist Professor Douglas Massey and Harvard sociologist Professor Robert Sampson consider the Moynihan report probably the most famous piece of social scientific analysis never published. Completed in March 1965 as an internal document by a young Assistant Secretary of Labor, it was written as an input to an ongoing debate within the administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson about how to move forward grappling with the Negro problem in the wake of the landmark passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The report, it argued in part that black poverty was more intractable than white poverty owing to the legacy of slavery and the persistence of discrimination and segregation throughout the country. These factors combined to put unique pressure on the black family, which was buckling under the strain, in ways that amplified the effects of other social problems and led to a tangle of pathology that perpetuated black poverty over time and across the generations. Moynihan's diagnosis was direct, and the report now anachronistic, what today would be considered politically incorrect and even offensive, jarring language should be read in the context of its time. So, for instance, the use of the word Negro in the report, which I just referenced. In the report, Moynihan writes that the role of family in shaping character and ability is so pervasive as to be easily overlooked. The family is a basic social unit of American life. It is the basic socialization unit. By and large, adult conduct in society is learned as a child. At the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society, Moynihan argues, is a deterioration of the Negro family. He then goes on to cite a number of critical social indicators: marriage dissolution, the out-of-wedlock birth rate, and the single mother household in the African American community. At the time of the report, nearly a quarter of African American women living in cities who have ever married were divorced, separated, or living apart from their husbands. And nearly a quarter of African American children were born to unmarried mothers. In large cities, the situation was even worse. In New York City in 1960, for example, not including divorces, 30.2% of African American marriages were dissolved. In Washington, D.C. in 1964, the unwed birth rate for non-whites was 29.4. Almost a fourth of African American families were headed by females. Moynihan then linked the family disorganization to the startling increases in welfare dependency. Specifically, he cites AFDC, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or the now defunct welfare program that was replaced by the Temporary Assistance to Needy Family, TANF program, during the 1996 welfare reform. So AFDC was formed in 1935 principally to care for widows and orphans. Moynihan notes that at the beginning of the program, less than a third of absent fathers in AFDC families were due to desertion. In the mid-1960s, it was 2/3. The 50% increase between 1948 and 1955, just 7 years, was primarily explained by family breakdown. Though prescient for its time, the Moynihan Report in the aftermath of its release was excoriated within the academic and public policy community for being racist, calling the black family pathological, and blaming the victim, among other reasons. And in the ensuing 2 decades, few, if any, ventured to speak of family breakdown and its consequences. Just skipping ahead a little bit and in history. Most of you may be too young to remember the television show Murphy Brown. It was a CBS sitcom about a news anchor and a television news magazine that ran from 1988 to 1998. In the 1991-92 season, Murphy Brown, the main character played by the actress Candice Bergen, chooses to become a single mother. The storyline prompted then Vice President Dan Quayle, during campaign speech, to criticize the Murphy Brown character for ignoring the importance of fathers by giving birth to a child alone. Dan Quayle was right is the title of a much-cited 1993 Atlantic Monthly article by the noted family scholar and writer Barbara Defoe Whitehead. In it, she builds a case that the social science evidence suggests that though it may benefit the adults involved, the dissolution of intact two-parent families is harmful to a large number of children. Moreover, family diversity in the form of increasing numbers of single parents and step-parent families does not strengthen the social fabric, but rather dramatically weakens and undermines society. Though nearly 30 years removed from the Moynihan Report, in 1993, any discussion of the changes in family structure still provoked angry protest and was very much a taboo subject. Dr. Whitehead cites several reasons for the explosive responses. Some see it as no more than an attack on struggling single mothers and their children. Why blame single mothers when they are doing their very best? Many marriage dissolutions are beyond the control of the involved spouses. Thus, it may be particularly cruel and unfeeling to remind parents of the hardship their children might suffer as a result of family breakup. Others believe that the dramatic changes in family structure, though regrettable, are impossible to reverse. Family breakup is an inevitable feature of American life, and anyone who thinks otherwise is indulging in nostalgia or trying to turn back the clock. Fundamentally, Dr. Whitehead argues the debate about family structure is not simply about the social scientific evidence, although that is surely an important part of the discussion. It is also a debate over deeply held and often conflicting values. How do we begin to reconcile our long-standing belief in equality and diversity with an impressive body of evidence that suggests that not all family structure produce equal outcome for children, she asks. How can we square traditional notions of public support for dependent women and children with a belief in women's right to pursue autonomy and independence in childbearing and child-rearing? How do we uphold the freedom of adults to pursue individual happiness in their private relationships and at the same time respond to the needs of children for stability, security, and permanence in their lives? What do we do when the interests of adults and children conflict? And it is this last question that merits a moment of pause. As Dr. Whitehead explains in her 1993 article, growing up without biological parents is not a newly invented 20th century phenomenon. Across time and across culture, the classic form of family disruption had been the death of a parent. Throughout history, parental death has been one of the risks of childhood, and it wasn't unusual for parents to die before the child was grown. This cultural understanding of parental death has formed the basis of a tradition of public support to widows and their children. And at the same time, other forms of family disruption, separation, divorce, out-of-wedlock birth, were held in check by powerful religious, social, and legal sanctions. Divorce was widely regarded as both a deviant behavior, especially threatening to mothers and children, and as a personal lapse. Divorce is the public acknowledgement of failure, a 1940 sociology textbook noted. Out-of-wedlock birth was stigmatized, and stigmatization is a powerful means of regulating behavior. Sanctions against non-marital birth discouraged behavior that hurt children and exacted compensatory behavior that helped them. Shotgun marriages and adoption, two common responses to non-marital birth, carried a strong message about the risk of premarital sex and created an intact family for the child. Consequently, children did not have to worry much about losing a parent through divorce or never having had one because of non-marital birth, Dr. Whitehead explains. But by mid-20th century, with advances in medical technology that drastically reduced the threat of parental death, a new standard of family security and stability was established in post-war America. For the first time in history, the vast majority of the nation's children would expect to live with both married biological parents throughout childhood. Then the 1960s arrived, and an institution of marriage would never be the same again. It went into a steep decline, one from which it has yet to emerge a half a century later. And the following slides will show there's no indication that trends are to reverse anytime soon. first to take a look at marriage. The first thing to know about this slide is median age of first marriage. It's a historical perspective, so I'm graphing it back to 1890 and to present day 2009. You can see that there was a decline, so people were getting married earlier in the first half of the 20th century, and as we hit 1950, people began to delay marriage. So right now in the United States in 2009, the median age of first marriage for men is about 28 years of age, and for women about 26. What this slide doesn't show is actually this great variation by, for instance, by educational background, which I'll touch upon a little bit later. This slide shows the marriage rate among women, the number of marriages per 1,000 married female in the population. And again, the same story here. There's a great decline, steady decline since 1940. The rate now is half of what it used to be 50 years ago. This slide shows the percent of married adults by gender and race from 1950 to today. The dark lines are for the overall population. The shaded but solid lines are for the white population, and the dotted lines for the African American population. I guess reddish, pinkish for girls and boys. And what you've noticed is that 1950, everyone started about the same place. Between 60% to 70% of the population were married at the point, and that's been declining steadily over time. And the decline is particularly dramatic for the African American community. So the share of married population is the lowest for African American women right now. This slide and the next one will show the percent of women ever married by various age groups. So the first one is for women, and the next one will be for men. So by age 20, what percent of the population, according to their birth cohort at the bottom, are expected to will be married? And just as a sort of a reference point here, for my parents' generation, those who were sort of born in the late 1940s, more than 40% were married by age 20 and more than 70% by age 25. And for my generation, those born in the late 1970s, less than 20% were married by age 20 and just slightly over 50% by age 25. So people 20-something and 30-something are less likely to get married. And the trends are very similar for men, but even lower for men compared to for women. So. This slide basically will look at the percent of marriages reaching various anniversaries for men, this slide, and the next one for women. So the first set of bars, you'll see the blue ones are reaching the 5th anniversary, marriages that have been intact for 5 years. And the next set will be for 10 years and 15, 20, so on to the last. Sort of the most right on the screen here would be for the 40th anniversary, those whose marriage lasted 40 years. And then you will see on the left and the y-axis, that's when the marriages were formed. So for instance, in 1995 to couples who got married in 1995 to 1955 to 1959, 88.3% stayed together by the time they hit 10 years. So most of the marriages last at least 10 years. Only 10% divorced or broke up for whatever reason at the 10-year mark. We're looking at 70% of the marriages are still together at the 10-year mark for the couples who got married in the early 90s. So this is a decrease of about 20%. This is just the same for the female population. Very similar trends here. And this, the next couple of slides look at the same data, but from a different data source. And this is just sort of a side note for those who are interested more in data. It's always good to have multiple sources of data, so you can always compare trends and to make sure the trends you're seeing, the results you're getting are really robust. It's not just one set of national survey, but another set sort of basically confirm the same finding or same trends. So this is slightly different. This is a different data set from the previous one, but it looks at very similar information. And what's interesting here is that it looks at the sort of intactness, the likelihood to stay intact at the 1-year mark, 3-year mark, 5-year mark, a 10-year mark by various characteristics. And what you can see here actually is important is that, for instance, it varies greatly by education. So those, for women who are college educated or more, 78% of their first marriages will stay together by the 10-year mark. So they'll hit the 10-year mark. It's drastically reduced if you look at those with some colleges, it's down to 62%. Those who with a high school or GDE, 54%. So half a marriage of high school graduates will not have made it to the 10-year anniversary mark. So there's great variation by education and also by race here that you can see. Another way to take a look is it also varies by various marital characteristics and parenthood. So actually the first bar at the top you can see is that for those who actually got married and then conceived and then had a child, so the normal sort of traditional course, their marriage is most likely to stay together, at least at the 10-year mark. 80% of those marriages will be together. They'll have celebrated the 10th year anniversary versus some of the other characteristics. So for instance, for marriages without children, only a third actually will survive through the first 10 years. More than 2/3 will have broken up at that point. So there's great variation with that. Another factor that will vary, that'll have an impact is the age of marriage. For those who marry after 26, their marriages tend to are more likely to be intact at the 10-year mark as well. Just a few slides on the divorce trends. So we've heard a lot about divorce, and there's a lot of divorce going on, and it's very common in society. And that is true. You can see in the data from 1940 to really 1960 to 1980, there's a huge increase in the number of divorces and just how it really pervaded society. And from 1980 on, it actually kind of plateaued, and it has been in slight decline. So in 2008, we have seen a decline in divorce rate, but at the same time, compared to what it was in 1960, the current divorce rate is twice what it was in 1960. This is sort of the mirror slide from the one before where it showed percent of ever married. This is percent ever divorced. If you look at the birth cohort, the bottom closer to those born in the 1940s and 1945, 50s, their sort of marital history is more complete. And what you see in this chart is that for the boomer generation, really, by the time they hit 55, 40% of those born in that sort of era, their marriage will have, they will have experienced a divorce. So 40% of the population, possibly greater, will experience divorce at some point. And that's the most complete set of cohort data that we have. Very similar picture for men as well. Cohabitation, which is also on the rise, and you've probably heard a lot about this in the media. This shows, the bottom line shows the percent of all sort of couples living together, so married and cohabitation. And what you see is the percent of share of cohabiting couples as a percent of all couples has risen since the 1960s, and it's about 10%. So 1 out of 10 couples living together are not married. And the top bar shows, top line should say, shows the percent of cohabiting couples with children. So right now, close to 40%, 38% of cohabiting couples actually have children living in their home. Cohabitation does impact marriage as well, marriage stability. So this shows that this is actually, again, it's very similar to the earlier slides looking at the likelihood of first marriages reaching various anniversary by cohabitation backgrounds, whether or not the couple actually cohabitated before they got married. And as you can see that it does make a difference for those who have cohabited before they got married. The likelihood of that couple reaching their 10th anniversary is different for those who did not cohabitate before they got married. So those are just some slides. And really the dramatic slides, I think, are looking at children's living arrangements. So we looked at adult trends and what's happening with marriage and divorce and cohabitation, but what about the children involved? Paul Amato, who is a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania, declares that perhaps the most profound change in the American family over the last 4 decades has been the decline in share of children growing up in household with both biological parents. And you can really just see sort of the dramatic picture here. This plots back to 1880 to 2009, but the earlier years are really squished at the beginning of the chart. Currently, about 70% of children are in 2-parent families. This does include step families and adoptive families, and as well as intact biological families. So this is just families with 2 parents. And about 26% of children are living just with a single parent, most of them in single mother families. As you can see, very few are living with single fathers, and then there's a small percent of children who are living with no parents, so with grandparents or foster parents. This chart looks at the 1-parent, 2-parent gap by race. And so what you'll see, the solid lines are the 2% of kids living in two-parent family, and the dotted lines are percent of kids living in single-parent family. The red line represents, I think, the white population. The blue line is for everyone, so all races. The green line for African Americans, the yellow line for Hispanics. And what you'll see is the gap are narrowing for all groups. And so what it really means is that fewer kids are living with two parents and more are living with just single parents. The gap was narrowing for African Americans. It actually crossed over in the 1970s. Mid-1970s, more African American children were living with just single parents than with two parents. Just a more detailed look broken down by race. This picture is looking at for white children between 1960 and 2009. You can see again the sort of decline in percent of kids living in two-parent families and the increase living in one-parent family, primarily with their single mothers. This slide is for African American children. And that was reflected in earlier, so more of them are living with single parents, over 50%, and 49% 2009 are living with single mothers only. And this is for Hispanic children. The data is more recent, so we don't have as much historical data. This is back to 1980, so the trends aren't as dramatic as for some of the other groups we saw earlier. Primarily, really, the increase in children living in single-parent homes now is driven by the trends in out-of-wedlock childbirth. Earlier in the 60s and 70s, it was really driven by children of divorce. So when parents divorce, the child ends up living with just mom, or primarily mom. But since the 80s, really, the increase is driven by unmarried parents having children, single moms having children. So that's the green line. You can see the increase in children living with never married parent. And this is the out-of-wedlock birth rate by race from 1940 to 2008. The dark blue line, I guess the navy blue line, is the overall rate. Underneath, the slightly lighter shade blue is for whites. The green is for African Americans, and then the orange is for Hispanics. So in 2008, about 40.6% of children overall are born out of wedlock. That percent for African Americans is 72.3. So what it means is 7 out of 10 African American children are born to unwed mothers. And it's about 52% for Hispanics and 28.6% for whites. And this percentage we're looking at for the white family was about what Daniel Patrick Moynihan was looking at in 1965 when he was looking at the African American family. Just a quick snapshot of 2009 exactly. You know, the one parent, two parent does hide a lot of sort of the nuances, the diversity that you see out there. Really, you know, sort of the vast majority of kids, I shouldn't say vast majority, the majority of kids, 61% are living in intact, meaning, you know, married biological parents. But the 61%, the snapshot, doesn't capture, in fact, sort of the dynamic of what's going on over the child's overall childhood. In fact, you know, demographers like Larry Bumpass have estimated that about 1 in 2, you know, half the children of this generation will have experienced a single-parent family at some point during their childhood. So the figure is actually lower when you look at overall childhood rather than just a single-year snapshot, for instance, in 2009. And 21%, the next largest group, will be those living with single mothers who are not in a romantically involved cohabitating relationship. Again, this is just a breakdown, more detailed breakdown of children in two-parent families. Most are living in intact, 88%. Some are, you know, with cohabiting parents, and some are with married step-parents, and some are with two parents who are not married, I guess, still in this step-family situation. And children in single-parent families in 2009, the vast majority, the 79% of them, are living with single, non-cohabitating mothers. And there's great variation within children's living arrangement too. So the snapshot you see, it does vary a little bit for the different groups. In fact, if you look at married two-parent families, most of the mothers in those groups are actually, there's great variation according to mother's education. So when you look at the intact family, 37% of mothers intact family are college educated versus 19%, so 19% in married step families. And it gets lower, less than 15% once you hit unmarried family and single mother family. So there's great variation, I think, and that has a lot of implication, and I'll touch upon that a little bit later, for children's resources and their overall well-being with this type of variation. So let's just go back a little bit to our narrative after all those slides. So what are the causes of the collapse of marriage? One can certainly look to the changes in divorce law in the 1970s. Of course, there's also the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. Some scholars have argued that modernization, changing gender roles, women's growing economic dependence, or the new labor market drove these trends, leading to arguably a second demographic transition. Others, such as UC Berkeley professor and Nobel laureate George Akerlof and his colleagues, have argued that contraceptive technologies and legal abortions alter the character of sexual relations between unmarried couples. Until the 1960s, engaging in premarital sex usually implied a commitment to marriage if the women became pregnant. Shotgun marriages were the frequent result. But the invention of the pill and legalizing abortion made unmarried women more willing to participate in uncommitted premarital sex by reducing the odds of pregnancy. Women who thought to hold men to the old rules, the traditional sort, therefore found it harder to compete successfully for boyfriends. Even women who were unwilling to get abortion responded to this competitive situation by engaging in more marital sex. When such women became pregnant, however, they no longer could rely on social pressure to secure a marriage. Non-marital birth therefore rose. Harvard economists Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz have written on the power of the pill, how the diffusion of oral contraceptives changed women's career and marriage decisions. They argue that although the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, approved the pill in 1960 and spread rapidly among married women, it became widely used among young single women only in the late 1960s after state law changes reduced the age of majority and extended the mature minority decisions. Professor Golden Katz find the pill effectively lowered the cost of long-duration professional education, such as law school and medical school, for women, thereby raising the age at first marriage. While the pill may have contributed to the delay in marriage among women, it fails to explain the explosion in out-of-wedlock childbearing, which you just saw in the earlier slides, which rose from 5.3% in 1960 to 40.6% in 2008, an increase of about 666%. That is, in 2008, 4 out of every 10 children born were born to unwed mothers. Indeed, one would think that the pill so widely popular would have or should have reduced the unwed birth rate. To better understand the trends here, a few common misconceptions about non-marital birth should be clarified. First, unwed birth today is not a teenage thing, as popularized by teen celebrities and MTV shows, or as was the case in the 1960s. Today, only 8% of non-marital birth occur to girls under age 18, yet 60% occur to young women in their 20s. It's really a 20-something phenomenon right now. Second, research by Harvard sociologist Kathy Eden, Stanford professor Paula England, and their colleagues on lower-income women who become pregnant outside of marriage, either as minors or adults, reveal that virtually none of these out-of-wedlock pregnancies occur because of lack of knowledge about and access to birth control. Third, out-of-wedlock births are generally not the result of purely accidental pregnancies. In fact, most women who become pregnant and give birth out of wedlock strongly desire children. The pregnancies are partially intended or at least not seriously avoided. The overmajority of lower-income women who have children out of wedlock strongly desire to have children. And this is really great, comes from research done by Professor Eden and Kapalis, looking at lower-income women who have children outside of marriage. In fact, having children is generally perceived as the most important and fulfilling thing in their lives, giving their life purpose and meaning. So according to Professor Eden, lower-income non-married women view children as the best of what life offers. Whether planned or not, children are nearly always viewed as a gift, not a liability, a source of both joy and fulfillment. Low-income mothers credit their children for virtually all that they see as positive in their lives and rely on their children to bring validation, purpose, companionship, and order to their often chaotic lives. Given this emotional context, it should not be surprising that any plan to delay pregnancy are carried out haphazardly or not at all. Critically, almost none of the lower-income women who have a child out of wedlock feel that it is important to be married before having children. Although roughly half of non-married mothers were cohabitating with the father at the time of birth, nearly 75% were in some sort of romantic relationship with the father. These relationships are usually of short duration and unstable. Mutual understanding and commitment are lacking. And although the couples usually think and speak favorably about marriage, most tend to drift apart after the child is born. However, low-income non-married parents are not hostile to marriage as an institution or life goal. Ironically, most highly esteem marriage and in fact tend to over-idealize it. Most low-income women have traditional family goals. They hope to have a husband, children, a minivan, a house in the suburb with white picket fence. As my colleague at the Heritage Foundation, Rob Rector, who has studied this subject really for decades, knows, a major obstacle is that most low-income women plan to marry after having children, not before. Their life plan is the exact opposite of the normal sequence in the upper middle class. In the upper middle class, men and women still follow the traditional pattern. A man and woman become attracted to each other, a relationship develops, the couple assess each other, and at some point deliberately choose to become lifetime partners. Emotional bond happens, they marry, and after a few years have children. And you just saw sort of the trend in the attractiveness of marriage for those who conceive and have children after marrying, and those who are college educated. Those marriages tend to be more lasting. But in the lowest income third of the US population, this traditional sequence of family formation and childbearing is exactly reversed. Women first have children and then seek to find or build a stable relationship that will eventually lead to marriage. Typically, low-income single mothers do not see marriage either as an important part of child-rearing or as an important element of financial security or upward social mobility. Instead, marriage is seen as a symbolic event that should occur later in adult life. Marriage is regarded as an important ceremony that will celebrate one's eventual arrival in the middle class, rather as a vital pathway that leads to upward mobility and attainment of middle class status. Lower income single mothers believe that marriage, not children, is what requires the years of careful planning and preparation, and then childbearing is something that happens along the way. My colleague's analysis underscores two arguments. First, it reinforces the marriage gap thesis. Many of you may be familiar with Manhattan Institute senior fellow Kate Heimewitz's book, Marriage and Caste in America, Separate and Unequal Families in a Post-Marital Age. In it, she argues that college-educated women never went for the Murphy-Brown thing, and there's a growing disparity between the educated and less educated women in regard to marriage and childbearing. As researchers began to disaggregate the data, they found that college-educated women still get married, albeit a little bit later. In fact, the median age at first marriage for highly educated women is over 30, compared to under 25 for those with lower levels education. So the slide we saw earlier when I mentioned that it does vary by education level. For few college-educated women have children outside of marriage. For example, among college-educated mothers, only 8% are unmarried. The vast majority, 92%, are married mothers. So just think about your classmates and your university campuses. How many of them are unwed mothers? Virtually none. By contrast, among mothers who drop out of high school, 2/3, 67.4% are unmarried, and only a third, 32.6%, are married mothers. The figure is about 51 unmarried and 49 married for high school graduates. The same gap applies to divorce. While divorce has tapered for all, for college-educated women, the declining trend is more significant. All of these have serious implications for adults and for children in particular. As Princeton sociologist Sarah McClanahan argues, the second demographic transition is widening social class disparities in children's resources. Children who were born to mothers from the most advantaged backgrounds are making substantial gains in resources. Relative to their counterparts 40 years ago, their mothers are more mature and more likely to be working at well-paying jobs. These children were born into stable unions and are spending more time with their fathers. In contrast, children born to mothers from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are making smaller gains, and in some instances, even losing parental resources. Their mothers are working at low-paying jobs. Their parents' relationships are unstable, and for many, support from their biological father is minimal. Although their parents are more educated than they were 40 years ago, children's claims on their parents' resources are weaker. All of this echoes the key value conflict mentioned in Dr. Whitehead's 1993 article. What do we do when the interests of adults and children conflict? Although researchers have attributed the second demographic transition to the reemergence of feminist movement in the 70s, the development of contraceptive technology, changes in labor market, even government policies, the root causes must lie deeper still. Indeed, the fundamental reason, Dr. Whitehead explains, is that at some point in the 1970s, Americans changed their minds about the meaning of divorce, separation, out of wedlock childbearing. What had once been regarded as hostile to children's best interests was now considered essential to adults' happiness. The evidence she points to is compelling. In the 1950s, most Americans believed that parents should stay in unhappy marriage for the sake of the children. The assumption was that divorce would damage the children, and the prospect of such damage gave divorce its meaning. By the mid-1970s, a majority of Americans rejected that view. As a popular divorce book proclaims, a two-parent home is not the only emotional structure within which a child can be happy and healthy. The parents who take care of themselves will be the best able to take care of their children. About the same time, the long-standing taboo against out-of-wedlock childbirth also collapsed. By the mid-1970s, 3/4 of Americans said that it was not morally wrong for women to have a child outside of marriage. Once the social metrics shifted from child well-being to adult well-being, it is hard to see divorce and non-marital birth in anything but a positive light. They hold out the promise of greater adult choice, freedom, and happiness, writes Dr. Whitehead. So how has half a century of adult choice, freedom, and happiness actually contributed to the individual adult and child and social well-being? Well, the short answer is not very much, and likely some harm as well. Decades of research has demonstrated that marriage and the intact family matters. They benefit both adults and children. And before I sort of dive into some of the social science literature here, just want to have a few points of clarification about some of the research out there. Most social scientific research seek causation. After all, that's sort of the interesting question. Does X cause Y? Does divorce cause adult happiness? Does divorce cause children to do poorly in school? However, most social science research relies on statistics, and statistics is a probabilistic endeavor. Causation is almost impossible to prove unless, of course, one conducts a double-blind, perfectly randomized control experiment, the gold standard in social science. But it's probably near impossible to get an experiment approved by any institutional research for a human experiment on marriage that you would have one group get married, have kids, and observe what happens, and have an identical group not get married, have children, and observe what happens. So we have to rely on statistics, inferential statistics. And what inferential statistic does is reports correlations, just the relationship between two variables, X and Y. It describes on average what is the likely outcome for a sample population. So the outcome is not deterministic. For example, when a study reports that children in intact family on average perform better in school compared to peers in non-intact families, the results are the averages of the outcomes in the sample for the children in intact family and the non-intact families. Of course, some children of non-intact families may very well have performed better than those in intact families, and being in an intact family is not a guarantee for academic success. And just because a single study says something in probabilistic terms for a sample population, you really have to, you can't take that as sort of as a final result, and really have to look at more than just a single study, more than a handful study really. The weight of the available evidence should be really the arbiter of what the social science research data said. And after decades of research, the weight of the available evidence suggests that marriage and the intact family form mattered. Sometimes emergent research will show that the existing body of evidence needs to be revised, and sometimes revised again and again as data and research methodologies continue to advance. It's an ongoing process. As Professor Sarah McLonahan and Gary Sanford write in 1994, during the 1950s and 60s, most studies showing the negative consequences of single parenthood were based on small convenience samples, children in treatment for psychological disorder or wards of the court, and so could not be generalized to the population. In 1973, this conventional wisdom that children who grow up with single mothers have serious problems was challenged, and existing research was criticized on methodological grounds by two researchers, Herzog and Sudia, in a lengthy review. They concluded that the scientific basis for concern over single mother family was weak, and any adverse effect was due to socioeconomic status. However, instead of stimulating a large-scale effort to test the hypothesis that living in one-parent family had no negative consequences for children, when social class differences were taken into account, the review itself was taken as evidence that no consequence existed. This occurred despite the fact that the two researchers, Herzog and Sudia, carried out no empirical research, and despite their explicit statement that living in one-parent family hides some negative effects for children. Of course, in the wake of the Moynihan controversy, researchers were particularly reluctant to pursue this line of research, and little was done on the impact of family structure on child well-being for decades. Eventually, a line of research that addressed the question in a less controversial way emerged. It used longitudinal research designs and focused on white middle-class families and on divorce rather than desertion and out-of-wedlock birth. Two studies were particularly influential. One was by Judith Wallerstein, research on 60 divorcing couples in Berkeley, California, and another by Mavis Hetherington, a study of 124 Virginia families. Both researchers found that divorce had negative consequences for children, at least during the initial period after the parents' separation. Later in 1976 and 1981, the National Survey of Children, carried out under the direction of Professors Frank Furtensberg and Nicholas Seal and their colleague, accumulated more data on divorce and child well-being using a national sample of approximately 2,000 children. Overall, the surveys confirmed the finding that divorce reduced children's school performance and social adjustment. In the 1990s, professors Paul Amato and Bruce Keith published 2 meta-analyses of the existing research on divorce. The first focused on the research published in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and the second on research in the 1990s. The latter meta-analysis, as does the earlier one, concludes that children with divorced parents on average score significantly lower on various measures of well-being than did children with continuously married parents. As before, the differences between the two groups were modest rather than large. Nevertheless, the more recent study revealed that children with divorced parents continue to have lower average levels of cognitive, social, and emotional well-being, even in a decade in which divorce had become common and widely accepted. And in the last 20 years, research has gone beyond the divorce effect and is increasingly focusing on the diverse forms of family structure, step-families, different forms single-parent families, and even non-parental families. Yet, even after decades of building evidence, the view that family structure doesn't matter still persists in the academy. Some scholars are very reluctant about or even outright denying the importance of family structure and child well-being, often with selective interpretation of statistical results. And for those who are interested in this topic, one of the recommended readings, a short piece by UT Austin sociologist Norma Glenn, really tackles this problem. And so it's a great read for those who may encounter arguments that marriage doesn't matter for children, or children fare just as well regardless of family form. And if you encounter these debates, it's important to understand the social science data as well as have a good grasp of the statistics involved. So how do marriage and impact family form benefit individual and society? This is just really great research. Actually, I want to go back to this slide here. Really sort of the weight of the evidence compiled by a group of family scholars. It's a report put out by the Institute for American Values. Some of you may be familiar. They do just really tremendous work here. This is sort of decades of research and the findings that they've come across for marriage and family. Marriage increases the likelihood that fathers and mothers have good relationship with their children. Cohabitation is not the functional equivalent of marriage. Growing up outside an intact marriage increases the likelihood that children themselves will divorce and become unwed parents. Marriage is a virtually universal human institution. Marriage and the normative commitment to marriage foster high-quality relationships between adults as well as between parents and children. Marriage has important biosocial and consequences for adults and children. Looking at marriage and economics, divorce and unmarried childbearing increases poverty for both children and mothers. Married couples seem to build more wealth on average than single or cohabitating couples. Marriage reduces poverty and material hardship for disadvantaged women and their children. Minorities benefit economically from marriage. Married men earn more money than do single men with similar education and job histories. Parental divorce or failure to marry appears to increase children's risk of school failure. Parental divorce reduces the likelihood that children will graduate from college and achieve high status jobs. And in this chart, sort of just pausing a little bit on marriage and child well-being, there's a piece in one of the recommended reading by Professor Motto looking at marriage and adolescent well-being. The chart basically shows, if family structure stayed in 2000, stayed the same as what it was back in 80s and 90s and 60s, what sort of, how many fewer children we would see repeat a grade, be suspended from school, delinquency, commit acts of violence, are in therapy, substance use, or had suicide ideation. So the well-being children are affected. And if family structure forms were the same as was decades ago, child well-being would be at a different place today than it was before. So just to continue on with other benefits the report has, children who live with their own married to parents enjoy better physical health on average than do children in other family forms. Parental marriage is associated with a sharply lower risk of infant mortality. Marriage associated with reduced rates of alcohol and substance abuse for both parents and teens. Married people, especially married men, have longer life expectancies than do other similar singles. Marriage is associated with better health and lower rates of injury, illness, and disability for both women and men. Marriage seems to be associated with better health among minorities and the poor. Looking at marriage and emotional well-being and safety, children whose parents divorce have higher rates of psychological distress and mental illness. Divorce appears to increase significantly the risk of suicide. Married mothers have lower rates of depression than do single or cohabitating mothers. Boys raised in single-parent families are more likely to engage in delinquency and criminal behavior. Marriage appears to reduce the risk that adults will be either perpetrators or victims of crime. Married women appear to have lower risk of experiencing domestic violence than do cohabitating or dating women. A child who's not living with his or her own two married parents is at greater risk of child abuse. And just to sort of go back a little bit in child well-being, because I think that's just really important and sort of the focus of one of the questions that we've been grappling with, the conflict between adult interest and child well-being interest. Just last month, the Future Children Journal, a joint venture between Princeton University and Brookings Institution, a think tank in Washington, D.C., devoted an entire issue to fragile families or unwed families with children. Incidentally, this really famous data set is actually housed in Princeton University, and there's an entire center and a lot of researchers devoted to analyzing the data and looking at what the data said. And one of the chapters focused specifically on fragile family and child well-being, serving 14 studies that looked at this data set. 7 of the studies found positive effect of traditional two-parent family, and 8 of the studies found negative effect of non-traditional family in the areas of child abuse, obesity, asthma, health, and cognitive outcome, behavioral problems, and childbirth weight. So why do single-parent families put children at risk? Likely the answer is to be found in several pathways. Researchers have offered several possible causal mechanisms: parental economic resources, income, for instance, parental relationship quality, parenting quality, father's involvement, and selection. For example, right in the late 1990s, Professor McClanahan noted that the research suggests that remarriage does not mitigate the negative consequences of single parenthood. Children raised in step families do about just as well or as poorly as children raised in single parent families do. This finding suggests that income is not the only factor accounting for the negative effect of a parent's absence. She has basically argued that income is clearly the most important factor, which she thinks explains about 50% of the difference between, 50% of the difference in educational achievement of children raised in one versus two parent families. Less parental supervision, especially from the fathers, and less social capital because families move more often to account for the remaining difference in children's well-being. Research also reveals that the type of family and the type of child well-being outcome matter. In a review of 17 studies, Professor McClanahan finds that in all but 2 of the studies report negative consequences for non-intact family forms. However, there are significant variations. For example, growing up in a divorced or never married family is almost always associated with lower educational attainment and more behavioral and psychological problems. In contrast, growing up with a widow parent is almost never associated with poor outcomes for children. The timing of the parent's absence matters as well. Recent disruptions, including both divorce and remarriage, are especially difficult for children. Moreover, remarriage is not a panacea for divorce or out-of-wedlock childbearing. Although children's step-families fare somewhat better than children in single-parent families in educational attainment, they do somewhat worse based on measures of behavior and psychological problems. It is also unclear which is more important, family structure or income, although it is clear they are not proxies. In most instances, coming from a non-intact family reduces a child's chance of success, even after low income is taken into account. In some instances, the net effect of family structure is larger than the net effect of poverty. In others, it's smaller. Based on the evidence, Professor McClanahan suspects that family structure is likely more important than poverty in determining behavioral and psychological problems, whereas poverty is more important than family structure in determining educational attainment. For more, as I mentioned earlier, on child well-being, if you're really interested in this issue, the short piece by Professor Motto really is a great summary and has a lot of research cited, so that's a good resource to consult. Society bears the cost of family breakdown as well. In just fiscal terms, the costs are huge. A joint report by the Institute for American Values and their partners found, using very conservative methodologies, that the annual estimated cost of family breakdown to taxpayers is about $112 billion. The Heritage Foundation has estimated in just 2008, single parent with children receive about $280 billion, or 40% of all the means-tested government aid. Recently, my colleague at the Heritage Foundation, Robert Rector, published a new analysis on the link between marriage and poverty. And the report actually came with a book of charts, and since it's done by our senior graphics editor, the charts are much nicer looking than mine, so I thought I would just share with you just a little bit. Some of them have very similar information than what you saw earlier. This is just looking at the growth of unwed childbearing in the US from 1929 to 2008. Again, the huge rise in out-of-wedlock childbearing The slight pause in the early 90s was a positive trend that I will sort of reference a little bit later, but it was a pause, it was not a decrease, and then it kept going up again, and now it's about 40.6%, as I mentioned earlier. This is the flip image of the sort of the percent of married birth went from very high back in 1930s to about 60% in 2008. When you look at families with children, about a third currently in the U.S. are living in non-married families. Only about 2/3 are in married families. And then you look at the poverty rate associated with family structure. More than a third of the children living in single-parent family are living in poverty versus 6.4%. That's a reduction of 82%. So, so on the right, on the left, I should say, what you see is percent of children in poverty living in single-parent household versus married two-parent families on the right. And then you look at poor families versus non-poor families. On the left, you'll see non-poor families. The vast majority, three-quarters, are living in married family versus only about a quarter of children in married families when you look at their poverty status. This is a chart that we sort of covered a little bit earlier, looking at sort of on what birth occurred to teenagers, only about 8%. The vast majority is really to the 20-something. And then again, just to emphasize the point earlier about sort of the disparity by education, when you look at high school dropouts, the majority are unwed mothers. Among high school dropouts, 67%, 2/3 are unwed mothers. But when you look at college graduates, those who are highly educated, less than 10%, only 8% are unmarried mothers, 92 are married mothers. So there's great disparity and has implications, as I mentioned, for children as well. Again, this is information we covered earlier. Birth rates very strongly by race, 39% for all races, and then the different racial breakdowns as well. And this is just a trend graphically showing, again, what's been happening in the last few decades. And the racial composition of out-of-wedlock birth. On the left, you'll see is for all birth, and on the right, you will see for just out-of-wedlock birth. Because Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to have children without being married, they account for a disproportionately large share of all out-of-wedlock birth. Even so, the largest number of unwed birth are to white, non-Hispanic women. Non-married white families are 7 times more likely to be poor. So this is just disaggregated by race, and so for white family. And if you look at the structure, family structure, and it carried out for the other groups, non-married Black families are 5 times more likely to be poor. Similarly, non-married Hispanic families are nearly 3 times more likely to be poor compared to married Hispanic families. And then just, this is more from a policy end, I guess, of just going forward, public policy, what can we do? So just to conclude, the presentation here. I hope the talk hasn't been too alarmist, but I do want to emphasize that the problem is serious and the solutions will take great ingenuity, time, resolve, and courage. And there has been a silver lining or two to suggest that behavior can change. In the 1990s, teen pregnancy, birth, and abortion rates declined significantly. During the same period, more teens decided to remain abstinent during high school. Researchers aren't exactly sure what caused these reversals, but behavior did change. And so my hope is that the change that will restore the foundation of marriage and society will happen, and hopefully it will come from many of you and have the movement by many of you sitting here today. So that's the end of my presentation.
Hi, I'm Nadine. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. So you have lots of slides and graphs and things about how marriage has changed throughout time, and then like you skip to the present, and like present day you've got this poverty, how poverty is correlated to marriage or singleness, and I was wondering if you any data about how poverty has changed throughout the years.
Poverty has, at least since the 1960s, increased a little bit, but it's remained about under 20%, above 15%. So it's pretty much same. I mean, you see different recessions and depressions. Of course, there are increases during this period. So.
My name is Kendall Christensen from Brigham Young University. And I was just thinking what Dr. George said yesterday. So my question to you is, how do we respond to those bullies who say that bringing up these effects of alternative family forms does more harm to these families than it does good? So like bringing up the effects of these things on alternate family forms.
So
how would you respond to that?
So the argument would be saying that it does more harm to talk about these effects. There's more harm to talking about it than there's good.
Yeah, the other types of families
right.
are somehow, you know, hurting people and stuff like that. I brought that up, and people say, oh, well, you should spend your time helping these alternative forms rather than labeling them as, you know, bad.
Right. That's a very good question. I think, you know, sort of, I think one response would be, I think, you know, it's up to all of us individually to do what we can to help, and so that is one front, but not talking about the problems doesn't make it go away. I think part of, I think, the story I wanted to present here is that that's what happened when Daniel Patrick Moynihan in 1960, he pointed to a problem and everyone said, you're blaming the victim, you're doing really bad harm. And so no one did anything and no one talked about it for decades. Did the problem go away? No, it didn't, it just got worse. So by not talking about it, it doesn't make the problems go away. Certainly we can have better ways to talk about it. I think, you know, one way is to talk about the social science data in a fair and objective way. And so that's why I had a little bit about looking at data and saying it's on average. So we're not talking about all children in single parent family, all children in TAP family. It's an average. So we do know that there are differences, but you have to look at the data, you know, don't lie in that sense. And we have decades of research. So how you talk about it in a reasonable, objective way can help, I think, the situation. So.
Question at the moment?
Hi, I'm Maria from University of Virginia. And concerning divorce, what exactly are the major reasons for divorce and how have they changed throughout history in the past few years?
I'm not the divorce expert, but so I'll just sort of, I guess, speak vaguely on that. I think, you know, the trend, I think, I mean, there's sort of a lot of talk about, you know, sort of high conflict divorce in the past, and with no-fault divorce in the 1970s, I believe, it made it easier to sort of for people to say, you know, I want to walk away for this commitment. Some of the research now has focused on low conflict divorce. So where before, you know, you've seen cases, and you often sort of hear these cases of serious abuse going on, and it's just the adult's unhappy and is creating an unhappy situation for the kids. And so better, really, the argument for the parents to be apart, and maybe it'll be helpful for everyone involved. But a lot of it now is just low conflict divorce. I'm just not really committed to you anymore. I don't feel like I'm happy as a person. I want to get out of the situation. And so I think as divorce has become more common and widespread, sort of, I think the nature of the commitment has changed as well. And so it's easier to get divorced, and where you see a lot more low conflict divorces happening.
Actually, I'll add to
sure.
that. Piggybacking on that, one of the rationales for no-fault divorce was, look, this is a painful situation. The current court proceedings drag it out. It's hard on everyone involved, hard on the kids. So the actual motivation was to do some good, right? This will make divorce proceedings much quicker, get it over with, let people move on with their lives. And the unintended consequence of that was you actually changed what it meant to get married in the first place. Because before, in the older regime, when you got married, you knew that it would be tough to get out of it. But once you instituted no-fault divorce, you had this unintended consequence of, well, now I can get into a marriage. And actually, I know beforehand if I need to get out, I can much easier, which makes the initial factoring of the different factors to get married in the first place a different calculation. And actually made, so our grandparents got married in a way that is not even available to us today because of how easy or how hard it is to get out of it. Okay, Dr. Morse, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Morse. You had a slide that I want you to go back to. It's the slide from Ralph Rector's program there that shows birth, out of wedlock childbearing by education. Okay, you know the slide I'm talking about? I want to just call attention to that slide, you guys, because that's kind of the answer to Kendall's question. And also, this, I think you can think of this as your social justice slide. Okay, you guys, so you can go, I assume you can download this off the internet, this whole, usually Heritage Reports, you can just go download them for free. So you go get this and you go to that slide and you print it out, okay? And you go to your women's studies professors or your sociology professors or whatever, and you just point out the social justice implication of this slide. Because what you have here is that your college graduates, some college, highly educated people are living like Ozzie and Harriet. Okay, they're living the 50s lifestyle. They get married, they stay married. Look at that. 92% of college graduates are married mothers, right? There's basically no out-of-wedlock childbearing among people like you guys, all right? Like people like your professors. It's the poor who have had marriage taken away from them. Marriage has been wiped out among the poor. So how dare these professors of women's studies and all the rest of it be talking about how terrible marriage is for people and how oppressive it is when they are in fact taking every advantage of the institution of marriage, bringing their own children up with the advantages of marriage, and yet it's the poor, the children of the poor, who are trying to struggle making it on their own as unmarried parents. So this slide, I think this is dynamite, right? I mean, so I would take this, study it, and just think about what this means, right? That women who are highly educated, they have high aspirations for their kids, which they can't meet as single moms. Even a single mom with very high income can't get their kid into college, into Harvard by themselves or Princeton by themselves, right? You have to have a partner to make that happen. It's the children of the poor who are stuck with all of the disorganization, all the disruption, and all the lack of resources that's associated with out-of-wedlock childbearing. So, laminate this page.
My name is Bob. I'm from Generation Life. I was wondering, regarding this slide, is there any data that shows, I know you said this is difficult to determine, but is there any data that shows a causal link between lack of education and out-of-wedlock childbirth rates? For example, I was thinking if a woman becomes pregnant when she's in high school, she might be more likely to drop out, or is it vice versa, that because she drops out, then she's more likely to have a childbirth out of wedlock?
So what's sort of the causal
Right.
relation? I don't actually have data on that, but I think usually probably would be that you're in school, and then if you become pregnant, and then you drop out of the situation rather than dropping out. So we don't really have great data. It's harder to track some of the adults who drop out of high school already. So a lot of school surveys are done, for instance, looking at, there's a survey that looks at teen behavior, looking at teen sexual behavior and smoking, substance use, etc. They're really tracking high school kids, so the dropouts, there's a considerable population, but it's harder to track these kids because it's harder to find them, so there's less data that are available to that.
The microphone's right there, let's go right next, and then right behind it.
Hi, I'm Tony. I'm from Princeton University. I had a question about this slide as well, because I wonder how you would respond to somebody who said that the higher percentage of married mothers among educated people is due to contraceptive education among the more educated population.
Yeah, that's a great question. The research I would refer you to will be, it's done by Professor Eaton that I mentioned. I think she's at Harvard, and Professor England at Stanford. Do you have the title of the book here? But basically what they did was they did more qualitative type of research. It's part of the fragile family, and they basically, and you also know the book is Promises I Can Keep by Professor Eaton and Professor Kafalis. Basically they did more sort of qualitative research looking at this population of low income women who have kids out of wedlock. And one of the really striking lines in the research is that these women, it's not about access or knowledge about contraceptive use. In fact, if you look at clinics where you can get contraception, it's all around, these women are saying it's around our neighborhood, around the corner you can find a place. It's, I think even once I remember Professor England saying something to the fact of they're not quite sure, but it might be something to do with efficacy, just the sort of personal behavior, that what makes it hard to, stay in school, sort of the discipline, maybe something behavior going on that they're just not careful about sort of using contraceptive use. So it's certainly not knowledge. So a lot of, from a public policy front, where I'm coming from in Washington, D.C., there's just a lot of, the argument is more sex ed, bring it to high school, give them, free birth control in the schools, and that will solve your problem. That is not the answer. Access and knowledge, it's not. It's behavioral issues, and I think there's something going on, and so researchers are trying to get at it. But just part two of that would be, if you look at the research, and I mentioned this in the talk, by Professor Eden and Kafalis in England, is that I think these women, even though they don't really are not intentionally avoiding it. For a lot of these young girls, it is validation for their life. That they have someone to love and to care for, and so if it happens, it happens. And whereas I think college-educated women and many may sort of understand this sort of impulses. I want to do well. I want to get my college degree. I want to go to law school, med school. I want to do this and that, and then I'm going to have get married and have kids. So the sequence is different. The goals are different in life, and I think that would probably explain a lot of the situation as well.